Hello everyone, I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Today we're going to explore a quiet but meaningful morning with Trieu Dung as he carries his basket up the mountain to dig fresh wild bamboo shoots and bring them home for the very first meal cooked on his newly built brick stove. But the real question is, will the first fire rise smoothly through the chimney, or will the new kitchen fail its most important test before the rainy season arrives? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journey. Early in the morning, before the mist had lifted from the mountain slope, Trieu Dung stepped out of his wooden house and stood quietly in the yard. The air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of wet leaves, old soil, and smoke from the night before. Behind him, the small house looked simple, with rough wooden walls, a patch-tiled roof, and a new kitchen built beside it from red bricks and gray mortar. That kitchen was the reason he had woken early. For many days, Trieu Dung had carried bricks, mixed sand, shaped the stove mouth, and set the chimney pipe so the smoke could rise straight out instead of filling the room. Every brick had to sit firmly. Every gap had to be sealed. The stove had to hold heat well, but it also had to breathe. Now that the kitchen was complete, he did not want to test it with just any meal. He wanted the first fire to cook something gathered by his own hands. He reached for the old bamboo guai leaning against the wall. Its straps were worn smooth from years of use, and the woven frame had darkened from rain, sun, and forest dust. He checked the hoe and short knife, then placed them inside the basket. Before leaving, he looked once more at the new brick stove. It sat low and solid against the wall, with two cooking holes on top, a fire mouth in front, and a chimney pipe leading upward through the roof. It looked strong, but only a real fire would tell him whether it worked. Trieu Dung tightened the straps over his shoulders and started toward the mountain path. His first steps crossed the small yard, where the ground was still muddy from the previous night's rain. Beyond the yard, the path narrowed between wild grass and young trees. Water clung to the leaves, and whenever his shoulder brushed a branch, cold drops fell onto his sleeves. He moved slowly because he knew the forest had its own rhythm. If he rushed, he might miss the fresh shoots hidden beneath fallen leaves. The trail curved around mossy stones, past old bamboo roots, then rose into a thicker patch of forest. He had come here for mung rung, the wild bamboo shoots that pushed up after rain. They were not always easy to find. Some grew straight and obvious beside bamboo clumps, but the best ones often hid under loose soil, with only a pointed tip showing through the leaves. Trieu Dung knew that the first young shoots of the season would be tender enough for a simple meal, sweet after boiling, and perfect with rice cooked over a new stove. After walking for a while, he reached a bamboo grove where the ground was soft and dark. Tall bamboo poles rose close together, their green stems wet from mist, their leaves hanging like long, narrow fingers. He lowered the gui from his back and crouched near the roots. With one hand, he brushed away dry leaves. With the other, he pressed the soil gently, feeling for the shape of a shoot below the surface. At first, he found only old roots and broken branches. Then his fingers touched something firm and smooth. He cleared the soil and saw the sharp brown tip of a young bamboo shoot. A small smile came to his face. It was exactly what he had hoped for. Not too tall, not too old, still wrapped tight in its outer layers. He took the small hoe and dug carefully around it, loosening the soil without cutting into the tender flesh. When the shoot came free, he shook off the dirt and placed it in the gui as if it were precious. That first shoot changed the feeling of the morning. Trieu Dung continued searching with more patience. A few steps away, he found another one near a cluster of fallen leaves. Farther uphill, he found two more, partly hidden beside a stone. Each time, he dug slowly and cleanly, taking only what he needed. He was not gathering to sell at the market. He was gathering for one meal, the first meal cooked in the new kitchen, and that made every shoot feel connected to the bricks waiting at home. As the basket grew heavier, the fog began to thin. Sunlight slipped between the bamboo poles and touched the forest floor in pale lines. Trieu Dung stood up, wiped the soil from his hands, and looked down the slope toward the valley. From there, he could not see his kitchen clearly, but he knew exactly where it was. He imagined the fire catching inside the stove mouth, the pot sitting steady on the cooking hole, and the chimney pulling smoke upward. He imagined standing there without coughing, without worrying that damp firewood would send smoke back into the room. That thought mattered more than it might seem. In the rainy season, cooking had never been simple for him. Wind could push smoke in the wrong direction. Wet wood could burn weakly. A poor stove could waste heat, blacken the walls, and make the house feel unsafe. When storms came down from the mountain, the kitchen had to feel dependable. After gathering enough bamboo shoots, Trieu Dung tied the gui closed and lifted it onto his back. The weight pressed into his shoulders, but it was a good weight. Going down the slope required care. The stones were slick, and the mud held his sandals in sudden pulls. He used a bamboo stick for balance, stepping sideways where the trail became narrow. By the time he reached the yard again, the morning had brightened. The wooden house stood quietly in the sunlight, and the new brick kitchen looked warmer than it had before he left. Trieu Dung set the gui near the doorway and took out the bamboo shoots one by one. Their skins were stained with earth, their tips still fresh and tight. He rinsed them at the water jar, peeled away the rough outer layers, and placed the pale shoots on a wooden board. Inside the kitchen, everything was still clean in a way that made him hesitate. The bricks had not yet darkened from smoke. The cooking holes had not yet been marked by pot bottoms. Trieu Dung arranged dry twigs inside the fire mouth, added a few split pieces of firewood, and crouched in front of the stove. For a moment, he did not light it. He looked at the stove, then at the chimney, then at the pot waiting beside him. This was not only about making lunch. This was the first real test of the kitchen he had built with his own hands. Then he struck the match. A small flame trembled at the edge of the dry grass, caught the twigs, and began to grow. The flame moved slowly at first, as if it understood this was the first time the new brick stove was being used. Trieu Dung stayed crouched in front of the fire mouth, holding his breath while the dry grass curled black and the small twigs began to crackle. A thin line of smoke rose from the kindling, and his eyes went to the chimney pipe above the stove. For a few seconds, the smoke wandered inside the fire chamber. It twisted near the opening, touched the edge of the bricks, then suddenly pulled inward and rose up through the back passage. Trieu Dung leaned closer, careful not to block the air. He watched the smoke disappear into the chimney instead of rolling out into the kitchen. That small movement gave him more relief than he expected. His shoulders loosened a little, but he did not smile too soon. The fire was still young, and a good stove had to prove itself after the wood caught fully. He pushed in another dry stick and waited. The flame grew brighter, turning from pale yellow to strong orange. Heat spread through the brick mouth, and the crackling sound became steadier. Trieu Dung stood and looked around the kitchen. The brick stove sat against the wall like a firm promise. Above it, the chimney pipe ran straight through the roof with the joints sealed by mortar. Beside the stove, a wooden shelf held bowls, a knife, salt, and a small jar of dried chili. On the ground, the washed bamboo shoots waited in a basket. He placed a pot of water on the first cooking hole and listened for the change in sound. The bottom of the pot settled firmly on the stove ring. No smoke escaped around the edges. The flame stayed inside, feeding on the firewood, while the heat climbed upward. Trieu Dung stepped outside and looked at the chimney from the yard. A thin gray stream of smoke drifted upward, not too heavy, not blowing back under the roof. It rose cleanly into the morning air. That was the sign he had wanted to see. He returned to the kitchen with a calmer face. The water was beginning to tremble. He took the peeled bamboo shoots and sliced them into long pieces on the wooden board. The knife made a soft tapping sound each time it met the wood. Some shoots were pale and tender, with a faint sweetness in their smell. Others still carried the wild scent of soil and rain. Trieu Dung placed them into the pot to boil first, knowing that wild bamboo shoots needed time before they could become a good meal. Steam began to rise. This time the steam filled the air with the smell of fresh mung rung rather than smoke. Trieu Dung watched it with quiet satisfaction. For years, cooking during the wet months had been a struggle. In the old corner stove, smoke often leaked back into the room whenever the wind changed. His eyes would sting, his throat would dry out, and the walls would turn darker after every stormy week. He had told himself many times that one day he would build a proper kitchen. Now that day had arrived, but he still needed to see whether the new stove could hold its fire long enough for a full meal. He added 2 thicker pieces of firewood. The flame bent around them, slowed for a moment, then caught again. The bricks held the heat well. Even when the wood shifted, the fire did not die down. Trieu Dung used a stick to adjust the burning ends, then placed a second pot of rice on the other cooking hole. That was another test. A strong kitchen should cook more than one thing at the same time. It should let him boil bamboo shoots, steam rice, and keep water hot without wasting too much wood. The room grew warmer, but not suffocating. Smoke did not gather under the roof. It did not sting his eyes. Only the clean smell of boiling rice, bamboo shoots, and burning wood remained. Trieu Dung stood with one hand on his waist, looking at the stove like a tool he had finally learned to trust. Outside, clouds moved slowly over the mountain ridge. The rainy season was near. Soon there would be days when the sky darkened before noon, when water ran down the yard in muddy lines, when the wind pushed against the house walls and shook the trees behind the kitchen. On those days, a weak stove could make life harder. But if this brick kitchen stayed dry, held its heat, and carried smoke away, then even a stormy evening would feel less lonely. The bamboo shoots softened after boiling. Trieu Dung poured off the first water, rinsed the pieces, and set the pot back on the stove with fresh water. He added a little salt, a few slices of chili, and some green herbs from the garden. The meal was simple, but simple food had its own honesty when everything came from the land around the house. The bamboo shoots came from the mountain. The herbs came from the yard. The rice came from the sack he had carried home from the village. The fire came from the wood kept dry under the roof. As the rice cooked, he lifted the lid and checked the steam. The grains were swelling properly. The stove did not burn too fiercely, and it did not grow weak either. It gave a steady heat, exactly what he had hoped for when he shaped the fire chamber. He tapped the side of the pot, listened, then lowered the lid again. A little later, the first meal was ready. Trieu Dung took the rice pot off the stove and set it on a wooden block. He ladled the bamboo shoots into a bowl, the broth clear and fragrant, with small red pieces of chili floating on top. Before eating, he looked once more at the chimney. Smoke still rose smoothly outside. Inside, the kitchen walls remained clean. He sat near the doorway with the bowl in his hands. The first bite was hot, tender, and full of the taste of the forest. He ate slowly, not because the food was complicated, but because the moment felt important. This was more than a meal. It was proof that the work had been worth it. The new kitchen had accepted its first fire. The chimney had carried the smoke away. The stove had held heat, cooked rice, and boiled the first bamboo shoots from the mountain. Trieu Dung looked at the brick stove with quiet pride. Before the rains arrived, he had given himself a safer place to cook, a warmer corner to return to, and one more reason to feel steady in the small life he was building by hand. In this episode, Trieu Dung begins a peaceful morning by carrying his bamboo basket up the mountain to dig fresh, wild bamboo shoots after the rain. He wants to use these first tender shoots to prepare the very first meal on his newly built brick stove. After carefully gathering enough bamboo shoots, he returns home, washes and peels them, then prepares the new kitchen for its first real test. As the first flame rises, he watches nervously to see whether the chimney can draw the smoke away and whether the stove can hold steady heat. Step by step, the kitchen proves itself. The smoke escapes smoothly, the fire burns strong, and the rice and bamboo shoots cook well. For Trieu Dung, this simple meal becomes proof that his hard work has created a safer, warmer place before the rainy season arrives.